Wyoming Territory, 1879, the day Marshal Merritt Foster was forced to marry a woman he barely knew. The sky split with thunder, and the town of Rawlins smelled of dust and sour whiskey. He stood stiff in the courthouse, still slick with sweat from the 40-mile ride back from Carbon County, where he'd hauled in a cattle thief. His dark hair stuck to his forehead, and his knuckles were raw from the fight. When the judge called his name and pointed to the woman beside him, Merritt didn't speak. He just stared, jaw tight, as if silence might change the law. Her husband died last winter. She's got 2 children and no means to keep her land on her own, the judge said. You owe this territory more than law-keeping, Foster. You killed her brother in a shootout. Only reason you are not hanging for it is because everyone agrees it was justified, but justice still has a price. The woman didn't flinch. She was older than him, maybe in her 30s, hard to tell with the way grief sharpened the lines around her eyes. Her name was Nadine Hartley, and she looked straight at him like she expected nothing and would ask for even less. Merritt wanted to refuse. He was 24 and had never even courted a woman, but the judge's gavel dropped and the papers were signed before Merritt could get a word in. Outside, the storm broke. Rain came down cold and quick. Nadine didn't wait for him. She gathered her skirts, told her son and daughter to keep up, and started toward the wagon. The children, a freckled boy named Preston and a quiet girl named Pearl, walked behind her, both small and thin, like they had learned not to ask for too much. Merritt followed, soaked through, wondering what kind of life he had just been thrown into. The Hartley homestead sat 10 miles west of town, tucked into a bend of the North Platte River. The cabin was weathered but solid, with a lean-to barn and a fenced pasture. By the time they arrived, the storm had passed and the world smelled clean. Nadine climbed down first and opened the cabin door. There's stew left from this morning. You can take the cot near the fire, she said, not looking back at him. Children sleep in the loft. I'll take the back room. Merritt stepped inside, his boots heavy with mud. The place was warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and thyme. He watched Nadine move steady, no fuss. She served the stew, made sure Preston and Pearl had bread, then sat down across the table from him and ate without a word. Do you hate me? He asked finally. She looked up, spoon paused mid-air. No, you should. My brother made his choices, she said. You did your job. I buried him and moved on. You should do the same. Her voice was calm but not cold. There was something honest in it, something that made Merritt feel worse than anger ever could. That night he lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. He heard her moving in the back room. Heard her check on the children, heard the house settle into nighttime sounds. He did not sleep. Days passed slow. Merritt stayed. Not because he wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go with the law breathing down his neck. He fixed the fence, chopped wood, and rode out to check on the cattle Nadine had managed to keep. She worked too from dawn to dusk. Mending clothes, tending the garden, teaching her children their letters. She never asked for help, never complained. But Merritt saw the way her hands shook when she tried to lift the water pail. He saw the way she winced when she stood too fast. One morning he found Preston struggling to split kindling with a hatchet too big for him. Give it here, Merritt said, kneeling beside him. Preston frowned. Mama says I gotta help. You are helping. Let me do the hard part. You stack it. The boy hesitated, then nodded. They worked in silence, the sun climbing higher. When they finished, Preston looked at him with something close to trust. Later that day, Nadine caught Merritt washing Pearl's hair by the well. The girl giggled, kicking her feet, and Merritt looked up, water dripping from his hands. Nadine stood still, something shifting in her eyes. You did not have to do that, she said. She asked. Nadine let out a breath. Thank you. That night she handed him a fresh shirt. Yours is torn. This was my husband's. He was about your size. Merritt took it, fingers brushing hers. The touch was quick, but it lingered. He looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were soft then, tired but kind. She wasn't beautiful like the girls in town, but something about her made his chest go tight. She was real, strong, and she never asked for anyone to carry her pain. You do not have to keep feeding me, he said. I know. You do not have to be kind either. She met his eyes. I know that too. He opened his mouth to say more, but nothing came. Instead, they stood there in the quiet, the shirt still in his hands, the air heavy with something unspoken. 2 weeks later, Preston fell from the loft trying to chase a bird. His arm broke clean through. Nadine froze when she saw him on the ground, white as bone. Merritt scooped the boy up and rode hard to the doctor in Rawlins, yelling the whole way to keep Preston awake. When they returned that night, exhausted and bruised, Nadine pulled Merritt aside. "I panicked," she said. "I did not know what to do, and you just moved. He is your son. You are allowed to panic." She shook her head. "You saved him." Merritt looked down at her. Her eyes were wet, mouth trembling. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "I would do it again," he said. "Every time." She leaned into his palm just for a second, and he felt his heart twist. The next morning, she made coffee just for him, waited until the children were outside. When she handed him the cup, their hands touched again, and she did not pull away. "You do not have to stay," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I want to." She looked up, startled. "Why?" Merritt stepped closer. "You are the only person who has ever looked at me and not seen just a badge or a mistake. You see me like I am something worth staying for." Her lips parted. "You are." He reached for her then, slow and sure. She let him. When he kissed her, it was not wild or rushed. It was steady, like two people finding something they did not know they had been missing. And outside, Preston and Pearl chased each other in the sunlight, their laughter rising with the wind. The river swelled in mid-April, fed by the thaw in the mountains. It ran faster past the Hartley land, carving new grooves in the banks and carrying tree limbs downstream. Merritt stood at the edge one morning, boots inches from the wet earth, watching the water twist and boil. Behind him, the sun hadn't fully cleared the ridge, but there was a faint warmth in the air that hadn't been there the week before. Nadine came down the slope with a pail in one hand and her shawl drawn tight. Her steps were careful. She stopped beside him without a word, dipping the bucket into the shallows. The silence between them felt different now, no longer wary but full, like it had room for more. "What do you miss most?" Merritt asked, eyes still on the river. She paused, letting the bucket settle, time to think without interruption. She glanced toward the cabin. "When my husband was alive, I'd walk to the rocks past the ridge and sit, just a few minutes. Then I'd hear Pearl cry or Preston calling, and I'd go back." "You could still do that," he said. "I could," she agreed, "but now I'm not sure I want to be alone with my thoughts." He turned to her. "Why not?" "Because they don't feel like mine anymore. They keep circling back to you." The wind tugged her shawl. Merritt didn't answer right away. He looked at her hands, the way they curled around the worn handle of the bucket, every knuckle speaking of work and years. He wasn't sure what he'd expected when the judge forced them together, but it hadn't been this quiet pull, steady as the river. "I never had someone think of me like that," he said. She didn't smile, just nodded once and turned toward the cabin. That night, while Pearl and Preston slept in the loft, Nadine stayed by the hearth longer than usual. She sat across from him, mending one of Preston's shirts, her needle moving in neat, practiced strokes. He spoke into the hush. "You knew how to hold everything together long before I came." "I knew how to keep things from falling apart," she replied, not looking up. "There's a difference?" "Yes, one's survival, the other's living." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And which are we doing now?" She threaded the needle again, slower this time. "I think we're learning how to do the second." He let the fire crackle between them, warming the edge of his boot. "You said you used to sit on the ridge. Show me sometime." She looked up, surprised. "You'd go all that way just to sit quiet with you?" "Yes." She tied off the thread and folded the shirt. "Then I will." The next morning, Merritt hitched the wagon and drove into Rawlins for supplies. Nadine handed him a folded list, her handwriting small and precise. She didn't ask when he'd be back, just touched his wrist before he stepped up. In town, folks watched him differently. Not with suspicion, but with something softer. A few nodded. One older man at the mercantile asked after Pearl's cough and whether the garden had taken. "You look settled," the man said, loading a sack of flour onto the counter. Merritt didn't answer, just wrapped the purchases in burlap and paid in coin. He returned before dusk. Preston ran to meet him, boots flinging dust, and helped carry the smaller parcels inside. Nadine was in the garden, her skirts dusty at the hem, fingers smudged with soil. She glanced up when he approached, brushing hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "I brought what was on the list," he said, "and something else." She waited. He pulled a small tin from the crook of his arm and held it out. "Licorice root, for Pearl." Nadine took it, eyes softening. "She'll be pleased. She's not the only one I thought of." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a swatch of pale green fabric. "I remembered you said you liked moss sage. Saw this at the dry goods store." Her fingers hesitated before taking it. "You remembered that?" "I listen." She traced the cloth with her thumb. "I see that now." The next Sunday, he followed her past the fence line and up through the hills. Preston and Pearl stayed with their neighbor, the Crawfords, whose eldest daughter liked to read to them under the cottonwoods. Nadine moved slower than usual, not because she was tired, but because she wanted him beside her. They reached the ridge in time to see the sun crest over the distant mountains. The wind was sharper here, but not cruel. She sat on a flat rock, pulling her shawl close, and he joined her without a word. Below them, the land rolled out like a quilt, patches of green and gold, the river threading through. She breathed deep, eyes closed, and he watched the way her chest rose and fell, steady. "I used to come here to remember who I was," she said. "Before I became wife, mother, widow. And now I come to see who I might be next." He reached over, took her hand. Her fingers didn't tremble. "You're not the only one figuring that out," he said. They sat until the sun was high and the shadows small. She leaned her head on his shoulder and neither of them spoke. There was no need. When they returned to the cabin, Pearl ran to her mother with a drawing stick figures under a tree, one of them taller, one holding the other's hand. Nadine crouched to see it closer, and Pearl pointed. "That's you and Merritt. He's got a hat." Nadine looked up at him, her eyes lit with something deeper than surprise. Later, while she hung the drawing near the hearth, she said, "They've taken to you." "I've taken to them too," he said. "And to you." She didn't turn. "I know. I feel it." That night, when they lay together for the first time, it wasn't hurried. It wasn't about need or loneliness. It was about trust earned, care built day by day. He traced the curve of her back with reverence, and she held him like she'd been waiting to. When the fire burned low and morning crept near, she whispered, "For the first time in years, I feel like a woman again, not just someone holding everything together." "You're more than that," he said. "You're everything I never knew I needed." And outside, the river kept running, the hills stood sure, and the wind carried no storm. The edge of May brought lambing cries from the neighboring ranches and a scent of wild plum blossoms that drifted faint through the cottonwoods. Merritt stood at the corner of the pasture, running a whetstone along the blade of his penknife, while Pearl collected dandelions in her apron and Preston dragged a broken wagon wheel toward the barn, determined to make it into something useful. Inside the cabin, Nadine was boiling lye soap in the kettle out back, sleeves rolled and hair tied up beneath a kerchief. Her arms had gone pink from the sun, and when Merritt brought her a tin cup of cool well water, she took it without stopping, eyes on the mixture as it thickened. "You ever think about building on?" he asked, nodding toward the cabin, her brow lifted. "You planning to fill it with more than us four?" He laughed, soft and surprised. "I meant because the roof's starting to settle. Thought maybe we could put up a lean-to on the north side. Give you more room for your sewing." She tasted the water, then passed the cup back. "There's a beam in the barn you could use, but you'll have to patch the hole from that storm last fall if you take it. I'll climb up there tomorrow." She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already gone softer than the morning's light, and when she turned back to the kettle, he stayed a moment longer, watching the curve of her neck where it disappeared beneath the kerchief. That evening, Preston sat cross-legged by the hearth with wood shavings scattered around him, trying to fashion a new axle for his wheel. Pearl dozed on the rug beside the dog they'd taken in from the Crawfords, a brindled thing with a torn ear who answered to no name but followed her like a shadow. Nadine was beside Merritt on the bench, darning socks with her bare feet tucked up under her. She stitched in silence until she said, "You ever think about where you'd be if the judge hadn't done what he did? Riding fence lines in Dakota maybe," he said. "Or dead in some saloon brawl between men too drunk to remember why they started it. You think that's all you were headed for? He looked at her hands, steady in their work. I didn't think I was headed for anything, just running from the last place I failed. She set the sock down. You haven't failed here. I've been waiting to, he admitted. But it hasn't come. She reached out, her fingers brushing his knee. That's because you belong here. The words settled in him like weight in the chest, not heavy, just sure. A few days later, Nadine's uncle arrived on horseback from Laramie, bringing a sack of flour and a jug of cider. He was wiry and sun-browned, with a limp from a mining accident and a voice like gravel. He squinted at Merritt and said, "So this is the boy who killed my nephew and married my niece." Merritt stood his ground. "Yes, sir." The old man spat into the dirt. He deserved shooting. "But I'll say this, if you leave her, I'll shoot you myself." "I won't." Nadine came to the door then, hands on her hips. "You done measuring him, Jed?" The old man gave a grunt that could have been a laugh and followed her inside. That night they shared the cider and sat long after the children went to sleep, listening to Jed's stories of silver strikes and fool's gold. Merritt watched Nadine's face as she listened, her eyes bright and unguarded. He realized he hadn't seen that look on her before. When Jed left the next morning, he pulled Merritt aside. "She's tougher than any man I ever worked beside, but she's still just a woman under all that grit. Don't forget that." "I won't," Merritt said. That afternoon, Nadine stood at the edge of the garden and called him over. "I was thinking," she said, brushing dirt from her palms. "If we take down that old chicken coop, we could plant beans where the ground's already soft." He nodded. "I'll break it down tomorrow." She hesitated. "Do you want to?" He looked at her, puzzled. "Course I do. I mean, do you want to stay here, keep building with me, because I can't keep guessing." He stepped close enough to see the faint line along her jaw where sun met skin. "I'm not staying because I owe you," he said. "I'm here because I wake up every morning wanting to be where you are." She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just reached for him, hands still streaked with soil, and pulled him close. That night they lay curled beneath the patchwork quilt she'd sewn the winter after her husband died. Her head rested on his chest and her breath was slow, even. "I was afraid," she whispered, "that I'd never feel like this again." He ran a hand through her hair. "And what do you feel now?" Safe, wanted, whole. He kissed her forehead. "That's all I've ever wanted to give you." Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the scent of lilac from down near the river. And for the first time since he'd been forced into vows with a stranger, Merritt felt like he'd come home. Late June laid a heavy stillness over the prairie, the kind that settled into the bones and made every movement feel deliberate. The cattle grazed slow in the far pasture, tails twitching against flies, and the garden rose stood tall with promise. Merritt rose early that morning, boots quiet on the cabin floor as he slipped outside before the rest of the house stirred. He walked the fence line with his rifle across his back, not expecting trouble but knowing better than to turn his back on the land. A coyote had been nosing near the chicken coop 2 nights prior, and Nadine's hens had grown timid, sheltering under the wagon instead of roaming. The tracks he found near the riverbank were faint, already softened by dew, but his eyes followed them until they disappeared into the brush. When he returned, Preston was hauling water from the well, jaw set with determination. Merritt took the bucket from him without a word and carried it up to the trough. As he poured, the boy stood behind him, arms crossed. "You think you'll stay even when the law don't make you?" Merritt set the empty bucket down. "No one's holding me here now." "That's not the same as saying yes," Preston said. Merritt turned, dusting his hands. "I'm not leaving." Preston looked at him hard. "Mama don't say much about feelings. But she cooks more when she's nervous." "There's something she's nervous about." "She washed all the curtains yesterday, even the ones in the loft." Merritt squinted toward the cabin. "Your mama ever talk to you about the old wedding dress in the cedar chest?" Preston shook his head. "She never opens that chest." "I was thinking maybe she should." Preston didn't ask why. He just nodded and went back to the well. Inside, Nadine had taken down the summer curtains and was sewing new ties for them with strips of leftover muslin. Her fingers moved slower than usual, like something inside her was being weighed. "You ever wear that blue dress with the lace on the collar?" Merritt asked, leaning in the doorway. She looked up, eyes narrowed. That was my mother's. Still looked like it was meant for you. She threaded her needle again. What are you after? He stepped inside, taking off his hat. I want to marry you again, properly, with everyone knowing it's because I want to. Not because someone told us to. She sat back, cloth bunching in her lap. You know folks'll talk, say it's strange for a widow to remarry a younger man. Let him talk. We've built more in half a year than most folks do in 10. She didn't answer, but her hand reached for his. He took it, rough palms to rough palms, and waited. I kept my first wedding simple, she said after a while. We didn't have anything but a preacher and a pie cooling on the sill. This time, Merritt said, you'll have whatever you want. That afternoon, Nadine walked the slope behind the barn where wild primrose bloomed in soft pink clusters. Pearl followed, holding a basket, and together they picked the flowers in quiet. Merritt watched from the porch, not interrupting. He'd learned by now that women spoke to each other differently when men weren't near. 3 days later, they rode into Rawlins with Pearl in a freshly mended dress and Preston in boots a size too big, borrowed from the Crawfords. Merritt wore his best shirt, the one Nadine had pressed until the creases stood sharp, and tied his hair back with a strip of leather. The preacher met them in the churchyard under the cottonwood that leaned eastward from too many years of wind. There were no guests, just the children, the Crawfords to witness, and the sky above streaked in gold. Nadine wore a dress the color of new cream with a ribbon at her waist stitched in blue thread. Her hair was swept up, pinned with a single silver comb that had belonged to her mother. She didn't look younger. She looked entirely herself, strong, certain, and still. When the preacher asked if she came of her own will, she looked at Merritt, then said, I do. Merritt's voice didn't falter. I do. The kiss was brief, but Pearl clapped her hands and Preston looked up at Merritt with something close to pride. Afterward, they shared bread and apple slices beneath the tree, and Nadine poured cider from a jug wrapped in damp cloth to keep it cool. No speeches were made, no toasts given, but the wind softened and the sun stayed long enough to turn her hair to copper in the light. That night, back at the homestead, Merritt carried her inside and set her gently near the fire. The children were already tucked in. A pie cooled on the sill chokecherry and wild plum. She touched his face, thumb grazing the line of his jaw. You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again. He kissed her bare shoulder. You gave me all of it first. They made love slow, like the world had waited just for them to find each other. No promises were spoken, they had already lived them. Outside, the moon climbed over the ridge and the river kept to its course. Nothing grand had shifted, but everything had changed. Merritt would never ride another fence line alone. Nadine would never carry her strength without someone to rest it against. And in that quiet, steady cabin, love no longer had to speak loud to be known. The wheatgrass along the ridgeline had turned gold by August, and the days came slow, full of dry heat and long shadows. Merritt had taken to rising before the cabin stirred, riding out past the river with a coil of rope and a saddlebag of jerky and biscuits. He was breaking in a young gelding that had come skittish off the Crawfords' hands, and it gave him time to think about the land, the years ahead, and the woman waiting in the cabin each time he came home. Nadine had taken up a bit of fine embroidery again, something she hadn't touched since before her first marriage. Her needle moved in tight, clean stitches across squares of muslin she'd traded for in town, not to sell, but to make new pillowcases for the loft, where Pearl and Preston now slept side by side without complaint. She stitched a single letter into the corner of each, one P for Pearl, another for Preston, and then one more, an M, for the cot Merritt had long since abandoned. One evening, Merritt leaned against the barn wall, watching the last of the evening light spill across the field where Preston was trying to teach the brindled dog to fetch a stick. The boy's voice carried in bursts, patient and low. Merritt didn't move until he heard footsteps behind him. You've been quiet lately, Nadine said, brushing hay from her skirt. Thinking or worrying? He ran a hand through his hair, then crossed his arms. Thinking about what's next, for the ranch, for us. She waited, not pressing. I've been saving, he said, since before I came here. I never spent much, didn't have anyone to spend it for. I've got enough now to buy the parcel east of the river. Good soil, plenty of grass. She tilted her head. You want to move? No, I want to build. He looked at her. A house, one we make together. I want the children to grow up knowing their roof was raised by both our hands. Her mouth parted, but she didn't speak. There's space enough for a root cellar, he went on, and a room for Pearl with windows. Preston's old enough to help with the frame. She stepped forward slowly, fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. You're not just staying for us anymore. No, he said. I'm staying because this is my life now. You're my life. They stood like that until the light thinned out and the dog barked somewhere beyond the trees. They began clearing the new parcel the following week. Nadine measured with string and stakes. Merritt brought stone from the riverbed and cut cedar for the sills. Pearl helped scatter wildflower seed along the path they marked out for the garden, and Preston took to learning the names of every tool Merritt handed him. On a Tuesday afternoon, Merritt returned from Rawlins with a parcel wrapped in oilskin. He gave it to Nadine in the barn, where she was hanging dried herbs from the rafters. "What's this?" she asked, already untying the knot. He watched her face as she unfolded the cloth. Inside was a locket, brass and worn smooth, with space for 2 small portraits. She ran her thumb over the hinge. "I thought you could put something of yours on one side," he said, "and something of mine on the other, so it's always even." She opened it carefully, then looked up at him, her voice low. "I've never had anything like this. You've earned more than this," he said. She reached for his hand, not with urgency, but with purpose. "Help me hang the last of the rosemary, then let's go home." By September, the frame of the new house stood straight against the horizon. The children painted the shutters while Nadine stitched curtains from old flour sacks. Merritt built a porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a crate full of Pearl's dolls. They moved in on the first evening that smelled like autumn. In the new kitchen, Nadine lit the stove and set a pot to simmer. Merritt came behind her, arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Feels like we were always meant to end up here," he said. "Maybe we were," she said, "but I wouldn't change the road we took." He turned her gently, pressing their foreheads together. "I want to grow old with you in this house. I want to see our children chase their own dreams from this porch." "You will," she said, "because we've made something that holds." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves in the cottonwoods. Inside, love lived quiet but sure, stitched into every board and stone, held in every shared glance and well-worn hand. Years passed, and the house weathered seasons with grace. Pearl grew into a girl who read by lantern light and hummed while she worked. Preston became tall and broad-shouldered, his hat always tilted back like his stepfather's. Merritt taught him how to lay fence and choose sound horses. Nadine taught him to listen. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Merritt planted an apple tree near the porch. Nadine pressed her palm to the bark, then to his chest. "It's still beating strong," she said. "And always for you," he answered. They sat together in the dusk, hands laced, while the tree cast its first long shadow across the earth they had made their own. There was no more running, no more wondering what came next, only the comfort of belonging and the quiet joy of a love that had grown like the land around it, rooted deep and blooming in its own time.